Hola, me alegra mucho estar aquí con ustedes para esta sesión del tarde. Y esta sesión se llama, es una pregunta verdaderamente de cómo ecosistema del movimiento, cuál es nuestra estrategia interna y externa sobre cómo podemos hackear, pivotear, ampliar la filantropía, voy a ponerlos en cuotas, filantropía, para que fluyan más recursos hasta el fin de la violencia de género y a la liberación. Entonces, estamos en este tema y quiero dar un poquito de contexto antes de llamar a todos nosotros para hacer algunas introducciones. Y el contexto que quiero dar es varias. Primero, gracias. Quería tratar de hacer esta sesión en español, entonces espero que va a haber muchos problemas con mi gramática, pero bueno, aquí estamos. Entonces, queremos ponernos en el hecho de que hay una construcción de la idea de filantropía, y eso ha sido un proyecto política. Hay, por ejemplo, el colonismo de los white settlers, el imperialismo y el sistema económico extractivo que ha creado filantropía como parte de esos sistemas. Y sabemos también que en nuestras comunidades y movimientos hay prácticas lindas, profundas, sobre que también son prácticas de filantropía, como ayuda mutua, mutual aid, o stewardship of resources, como cuidar de la tierra, de las tradiciones, del lenguaje, de prácticas espirituales y también de recursos financieros, como tradiciones filantrópicas. En esta sesión específicamente estamos hablándonos de maneras diferentes de que nuestra gente que está trabajando adentro de instituciones de filantropía, podemos trabajar juntos con otros papeles en el movimiento para democratizar recursos financieros para la salud y el éxito de nuestros movimientos. Entonces, no queremos como limitar todo el complejidad de qué es filantropía, pero también queremos hablar específicamente del sector filantrópica dentro de los sistemas en que estamos tratando de cambiar. También queremos hablar un poco de qué es nuestras intenciones para esta sesión. Por ejemplo, sabemos que todos nosotros tenemos papeles complejos en nuestros movimientos y no hay como una línea de la gente que está adentro de filantropía y fuera, pero también hay responsabilidad que las personas que estamos que estamos trabajando y organizando adentro de filantropía tenemos como nuestro papel de actor que todavía estamos parte del movimiento. Entonces, con esto no es una sesión donde queremos poner a cualquier persona como en la posición de hacer un pitch para una idea, un proyecto. Tampoco queremos poner cualquier persona que tiene el papel de funder o de alguien que está trabajando en filantropía como en el papel que tiene como control sobre dinero. Queremos ser abiertos y transparentes sobre el poder que existe, pero también hold la complejidad que tenemos en ambos papeles. También queremos decir que eso no es como una sesión de contabilidad para novo. Pero podemos hablar un poquito de ese elefante que está en el cuarto sobre Novo saliendo del espacio. Y podemos hablar de eso y Priscilla está aquí para también ayudarnos con ese tema. Pero no es el enfoque. Nuestra intención realmente es enfocar en cómo queremos y podemos trabajar juntos a través de papel para movilizar más recursos y democratizar recursos para nuestros movimientos. Con eso quiero ver si Ariel o Saida, si ya está Priscilla o alguien más, tiene cualquier otro contexto para nosotros. Ok. Entonces, con esos elementos de contexto, quiero pasar a Ariel para llevarnos con introducciones.
Thank you, Jodeen, and hello, beautiful people, co-conspirators, remembering that to conspire, to share breath together, and just really grateful for this space, particularly as we come out of the broadcast earlier today. So many emotions. I was weeping with gratitude for this community and all the ways that it is going to ripple. It has rippled in my own life, in so many communities. And so just grateful that of all the things that you could be doing with this time slot, you chose to be in this conversation. You could be going to a healing session, hope that we can be a source of healing for each other as well. You could be taking a walk, and I hope that sounds like some of you are, and listening in and taking a walk. So just honoring all the ways that we're choosing to be here together. Wanted to just start with just noting who's in this room together. So if you can just share in the chat your name, your pronouns, a role, or maybe the place that you work, the organization that you work with, and just in a few words, what brought you to this conversation, and a reminder to use the resources that the interpretation team has shared for us to be in shared responsibility for our language justice practices, to use DeepL, so that in the chat, when you make some offerings, if you're able to translate your own message, that would be super appreciated. And what brought you to this conversation? And then maybe if you want to add also anything that you would like to share about maybe an early or initial funding relationship or opportunity, or how the funding sector was at the time that you came into your work with your organization. What was your first funding, or what was your first experience? I think it has been really rich to see what Jodeen was talking about, where we are not waiting for philanthropy, right? We are practicing our own ways of taking care of each other and resourcing each other. And so it's always helpful to share stories, both of maybe some challenges in interacting with the funding sector, as well as maybe stories of, I got a funding from mutual aid or what have you. So just any of those notes to introduce yourself and just say a little bit about how you're coming into this conversation. And then we'd like to invite some other folks into the circle with me here. So Aleyamma, and what else do we have? Ingrid, Shawnda. Am I missing anybody? Let's see who else. Toggling back on my little laptop screen to see everybody.
And I just offer, Laurel, anyone who's here from that list that we talked about in the beginning, we could highlight any of those folks.
Great. All right, thank you for joining our circle. So why don't we actually also introduce ourselves and maybe a little bit just what role we are stepping into this conversation with. I think that would be helpful. So Ariel, I spend half of my time with Resonance Network and half of my time with Collective Future Fund. So I am among the many of us who hold fluid roles in philanthropy and outside of philanthropy. So I will pass it in the circle over to Ingrid.
Thank you. Hi, this is Ingrid, she, her. The hat or wrap that I'll wear today is I'm the co-chair of the Solidaire board. And I'll also speak from creating the Movement for Black Lives resource table and the Movement for Black Lives Fund. And I'll pass to Shawnda.
Somehow I knew that you were going to pass it to me, Ingrid, and I wasn't ready yet, even still. But since you're here, hi everyone, Shawnda Chapman. I am the Director of Innovative Grantmaking and Research at the Ms. Foundation for Women. I think I'm here more though as a co-conspirator, I think, just to be frank and a little more accurate. And I will give it to Maheen.
Hola, hi y'all. Maheen, Kaleem, she, series pronouns. I am stepping into this conversation as the Vice President of Grantmakers for Girls of Color, as a survivor and a co-conspirator, and also as a former member of the Ending Violence team at Novo, in full transparency. And welcome the transparency and also like the comradeship in this community. And I will pass it to Aleyamma.
Thank you. I feel like all of our telepathic skills on being called on next have sharpened during the Zoom era. But my name is Aleyamma Mathew. I go by she, hers, and I am coming into this space as the director of the Collective Future Fund, which is a collaborative fund that is working to end gender-based violence. And am I the last one? Jodeen?
Thank you, Aleyamma. Jodeen Olguin-Tayler, and hats that I'm wearing, philanthropic hats that I wear lightly, but have for this conversation are, I chair the board of the Movement Voters Fund, which is a C3, C4 donor organizing network, and the Chicana Empowerment Fund, which is a group of Chicanas who have benefit from the sale of land and are directing the resources from that to support Chicana-led and rooted climate justice, and which is gender equity work. And I will pass it to Ariel, if I'm not missing anyone else.
All right, thank you, Jodeen. So we're just gonna be in conversation, and we have a few kind of juicy questions to start with in this circle, but then we also hope that we will kind of broaden it to everyone who's in the room with us to kind of just think about these things together and with the collective knowing of, you know, what we just came from, right? This enormous responsibility to bring forward, to pull forward the care that we've been building together in this movement for so long. And the idea that when we are in true mutuality, that we have a deep, really sacred responsibility for that. And we steward it in so many different ways. And for some of us who hold different roles in the philanthropic sector, there's a particular role of stewardship that has to come with deep care, deep accountability, deep learning, and that it's definitely within the context of everything that Jodeen shared at the top, right? That the sector has been rooted in systems that of capitalism, of settler colonialism, that, you know, we can't fully decolonize a system that is rooted in settler colonialism. We can't fully root out white supremacy in a system that is an outcropping of that, but we can seek to have a conversation about how to create liberated zones, how to be liberated gatekeepers in this work together of stewarding resources of all different kinds, right? So we wanted to start with this question of, for you and your work right now, what are you seeing as the opportunity? What are you actively practicing to expand your understanding and your ways of enacting stewardship within the sector of philanthropy, so that resources flow to the kind of collective work toward liberation that, you know, we have within the Move to End Violence ecosystem as our shared horizon, right? So we know what this work is and can be, and that it needs more resources, right? So what are you thinking about? What are you doing? What are your learning edges? And I think maybe we can start with some of the folks who are already really rooted in funding ending gender-based violence. So I don't know if I could pass it to you, Aleyamma, to kick us off.
Yeah, I can jump in. I guess before I get started, I do want to share, to Ariel's point, you know, just how humbled I come into this conversation. And the past few days, I am not a cohort member, but I have been a long time fan and, you know, have shared the road of MEV for a long period of time, both as a gender justice funder for 10 years and also working in the gender justice movement for the past 2 decades. And so the line between, you know, the movement and philanthropy has always been blurred for me. And I certainly see my role, especially at this time, to be one that is to continue to support this movement in very powerful ways, and I look forward to that conversation. But for those of you, you know, when I was asked to be on this panel, I was thinking about the word hack and what does that mean to me? And you know, I think in this technology era, hack, you know, means to sort of get unauthorized information from like your computer that gives you some kind of information and access. And I was like, do I do that in philanthropy? And most times, like us as people of color, we're sort of cut off from both the positionality and the access to that confidential information to share, even as someone within philanthropic institutions. And then I thought of actually my neighbor, Darlene, who is a very prolific gardener, and her use of the word hack, which is that she encourages me to hack off some of the branches of the tree in my backyard. And her logic is that if we hack some of the dead branches off, a new tree will grow and really like renew the whole constitution of the tree down to its roots. And so when I think about how do we hack philanthropy, I think there's a current situation where like allies that are in philanthropy are trying to cut out, name and then cut out sort of the things that are rootedness, everything from how we submit proposals to like what criterias to ways that annual budgets, right, are become this sort of glass ceiling for us and a threshold in terms of how much money we can get and how we imagine sustainability. You know, we also know doing gender-based violence work that the communities that are most adjacent to violence have been ones that have been overlooked by philanthropy. And what all of you have named around capitalism, colonialism has translated over to both explicit and implicit bias within philanthropy. So So I come to this conversation knowing all of those things. And what I do want to say about the Collective Future Fund is, one, we were created in 2018 with the support of Novo, Pamela, Pooja, and many of our other friends at Novo. One, to both expand to leverage the momentum of the Me Too movement, which turns, 5 years old this October, and bring more resources to the table so that Novo isn't the only funder and we're not sort of washed off of our boards when some information like this comes. So our obligation was both to provide resources as well as bring others to the table. Politically and socially, what was happening in the world was that Me Too viral was happening, but also we were seeing the uprisings after George Floyd's murder around the country and around the world, and of course a global pandemic and unprecedented climate change. And so these sort of like four really global, really historic, really connected issues were happening on the backdrop. And I think the privilege that I have of like running this fund is really to think about at this political moment, like what are the branches, what are the sort of dead roots that we're cutting off, and how do we kind of grow a fund that is really different, that walks alongside of movement and community. And then I can talk a little bit further about the ways that we think about that and are sort of imagining the future around that. I do also want to name the fact that our fund is like 2.5 years old. And we really sort of congealed and did our first grant making in early part of 2020, where we released $4 million in rapid responses to go to survivor-led organizations. And then in very early 2021, we followed that up by releasing almost $10 million in multi-year grants to Black, Indigenous, women of color, gender nonconforming, trans-led organizations, because we know how implicit and explicit bias leaves people of color leaders out and also undervalues their leadership. And we felt that we had to do that because of the big hole that so many organizations would see in their funds, following the onset of COVID. Again, I can talk more about our grant making, but I just wanted to give you sort of like a sense of both, how young and incipient we are, and also what we're trying to like embrace in terms of movements. And I'm sorry, the very last thing I'll say is that we're a collaborative fund, which means that when we were set up, it was not just Novo at the table, but there were 12 other funders that came to the table that made this commitment to support and, invest in building the Collective Future Fund. Okay, I will slow down. So with that, I will stop right there and, let my colleagues also answer, but I just wanted to share a little bit about the fund and how we are thinking about our work.
Thank you, Aleyamma. Ingrid, might I bring you in to talk a little bit? I know that you might have to hop off a little bit earlier, so I'd love to get your voice in here to speak a little bit about what you're seeing and practicing.
Sure, thank you. This is Ingrid, she, her. Yeah, and just to name, like I don't have sort of the most experience in gender-based violence funding. So I was going to speak around like movement resource strategy broadly. And also I've worked in philanthropy way longer than I thought I would. So even with that, I'm not an expert. So I think of myself as a resource organizer. And one of the questions I think that I've been sitting with and I wanted to offer, and I really hope that people feel and think differently, that they say so and challenge my thinking and my practice, is that we have the ability to actually think about the movement economy that we're co-creating. And my own encouragement to myself, and also in the conversations that I'm in, is to think about like, and I'll speak for M for BL, that we're building a movement economy And if we can sort of get to the place where we can think about it and talk about it at that level, philanthropic capital is just one stream of capital that we're really tapping into. Unfortunately, and one of the hardest things about being in this role is that resources tend to flow after Black Death. And, it's one of the things that, sort of you're constantly in a place of, negotiation and sensation around. But what I'm also remembering is that, after George Floyd was murdered, there were so many people who wanted to contribute and join our movements. And we actually had no door of entry for them. And so when I think about the amazing mutual aid funds that so many people created in 2020, it feels that there's a lot of opportunity and spaciousness for us to think about building movement economies that actually incorporate that and different forms of capital. People often talk about that we're living through one of the largest generational transfers of wealth. I work for a family of wealth, and philanthropy runs a tactical game. The money is on a long-term strategic view, but it's a tactical run, and we're not going to win if we also have a tactical play. And so, what I'm, I guess, sitting with, I think you said a question that we're sitting with is I'm sort of sitting with how do we really open up our mindset around resources and capital to think about it at a scale of an economy. And each organization actually has an economy, it's in the process of, and within that, I think, and this may be in contradiction with some of you, but I just have to share as a resource organizer, we need to deal and address our contradiction with capital. It's, some of my best days within or the early days of M4BL was when money moved. And then I saw that money actually cause conflict. I saw that money cause tension that took years and we're still in it to process and to unravel. And so I think that it's really hard to do this work if you're conflicted and haven't addressed some of your earliest memories of capital, and I put that out as more movement wide, not just us as individuals. But I sometimes invite people to think about your first interaction with money. And for some of us, it was connected to insecurity and not having it and people fighting and the desire. And then other folks have memories of feeling free because they were able to go buy something that someone put some, money in their hand. I think that it's really hard for us to think about resource strategy and capital if we're having conflicting feelings about it. And so I experience a lot of patterns in working with different movement leaders that we're in that place of contradiction. And so I just want to invite us to explore that. And I think the very last thing is, I'm sometimes in spaces where people keep pushing us to think about abundance. And, I'll name this, talk about a learning growing edge. That's a learning edge for me. But what sometimes bothers me is this idea, we know scarcity really well. And folks are inviting us to think about abundance, but no one actually asks us what's adequate actually. It's hard for me to think about abundance if I actually don't know what's the adequate cost of an organizer having a living and thriving wage, right? Before I can think about what's abundant, I think we can actually change and raise the floor. I think in philanthropy and my personal campaign in my lifetime, is to change how we fund and resource community organizers. That would be an exchange that we would have to do together, both as folks that are working in philanthropy, and as a sector and as a community. Like, we could also say, like, no organizer will be paid under X, right? Like, there's current movements right now to really raise how we treat and resource organizers, because we understand the critical importance of their work, right? And so I just wanted to throw out those questions as some of the questions that I'm personally sitting with, and also looking forward to be in partnership and community. And I will stay until I can, and then I'll jump off. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid. Whew, a lot to sit with when we think about building ecosystems. Maheen, can I bring you in to the circle conversation, and what's coming up for you? I feel like we've had a lot of conversations about the opportunities and pitfalls in this space. So yeah, eager to hear what's sitting with you.
Well, first of all, Maheen, she, her. I feel like I could listen to Aleyamma and Ingrid for a very long time. And Ingrid, when you were talking, I mean, I feel like I got taught how to navigate this philanthropy game from the best, including my sis, Tanisha McCarris, who told me in my first week at Novo, like, sis, you have to heal or think about what healing your relationship to money looks like, because it will show up in the way that you approach your grant making. And it will show up in the ways that people experience you as someone who is controlling resources. And I have never forgotten that. And it feels very resonant, Ingrid, with everything that you said. I think there are the things that are coming up for me are now shifting from where I was when I initially was not sitting with Aleyamma and Ingrid's brilliance. The first thing is, like, you both mentioned rigor. I think a lot, and it's because I have the great, like, privilege of working with Dr. Monique Morris, who is extraordinarily rigorous and demands rigor when we're thinking particularly about girls, femmes, and gender expansive youth of color, because they deserve our rigor. Our movements deserve our rigor. And so we think a lot about that rigor, coupled with, like, really rooting in where you started and where we started, where I think Jodeen started us, which was, we are actually rooting our practice in, like, how have our communities always taken care of each other? And for us, the particular question is, how have girls, femmes, and gender expansive youth of color always shown up to hold down our communities and to bring joy, to experience joy, to create and have beautiful and artistic vision? So, like, that is our starting place. And then the way we think about it is, like, how do we use our organizing chops to, like, actually move resources? This question of capital comes up a lot. It's actually something where, like, we right now have launched this thing called the Future Economy Lab, and it's bringing together, like, hyper capitalists with, like, young folks, and also folks who are thinking about all of the non-capitalist ways that we move and resource each other, to imagine, like, I think the question we sit with is, like, how do we capture back a lot of the financial capital that has been extracted from, to make sure that, I think the one thing that frustrates me to no end is, like, all the hoops that everyone goes to not give people cash. And, like, when you're talking about young people, like, everyone wants to start a program, and I'm like, just give them cash. Like the gift card won't even cut it. The, like, stipend will not cut, like, just put cash in their hands. And I see it with young folks, and I also see it with survivors, because when we're talking about gender-based violence survivors, we get infantilized a lot. And there is this trope that we are too traumatized to be able to manage money. And if you layer in, like, a girl, femme, trans, gender expansive, not white identity, that gets like layered in. And so I also like struggle with, like, I'm not interested in getting people, I'm clear, and this is my, like, I'm just going to be real, like my trauma from Novo is like, they're not going to trust us with their money, but like, can we capture enough of it and organize a rigorous structure to control and hold control over it, and also couple that with all of the other resourcing that we are doing? So it is a tension, it's a live tension, it's the like internal jihad in me on a regular basis. And so I think a lot about cash and how do we just move cash to people? Like I sorry, I can't look at the chat. But like I think that's where my head is at these days a lot. Because I have just been in too many conversations with people who have a lot of cash to give and just want me to do everything but give it to young people, including teach them how to manage it, but not actually give it to them. So that's one. I think the second thing is that we think about a lot is about accountability. So I remember being at a convening where a movement leader said, you know, where is your report to us, philanthropy? Like, we have to spend all this time reporting, like, where is your report to us? So actually, like, as I'm working with my team to figure out how we report back, we are looking at movement as the audience for that report so that you can hold us accountable to the organizing of resources that we are doing. And we can be in mutual, like, we can try to move with as much of a spirit of what we talk about at G4GC, this idea of reciprocity as praxis. Like, how do we consistently and rigorously engage the idea of reciprocity in the way that we move? The third thing is about control, like ceding power. Like the way we practice that is like we give young people control over decision making around a lot of our grants. And it is, I think, I was talking to Cassandra this morning and I was like, I'm still so shocked, I think, when people are surprised at the fact that we give girls, femmes, and gender expansive youth, like, you know, they recently gave like 68 grants totaling more than $4.5 million to organizations. But our funders are like, who is governing it? Who's controlling it? All of that. So I think one of the kind of questions I consistently sit with is, to be honest, like how much of our time and energy needs to be spent convincing people who I'm clear are not invested in our liberation, and how much of it is the tactical game, I think, that Ingrid was talking about. And then the last piece I'll say is around, and I guess what that means is like a rigor around our organizing practice. Like, so how do we, I got brought into philanthropy by Latifah Simon, who I was like, so philanthropy ... in a text message. And she was like, it's organizing with dough. Like, you know how to organize. And so I think with the same rigor that we organize in our movements, I'm trying to figure out how to, and I think we are trying to figure out how to be in right relationship with each other and with our fellow resource organizers. And then the last thing that I will say, because Ingrid, that thing around abundance is rough. And I say that because when we launched the 1 billion for Black Girls campaign, which is like just a call, it was just a call by some really brilliant Black women, including Dr. Morris and others, to say, what is not going to happen is that you're going to leave Black girls, femmes, and gender expansive youth out of this giving. And also the clarity that we knew that investment was short-lived, right? And so it was like, how do we make the call and how do we hold people accountable? And the rage and the reactions that people have to, how dare you demand $1 billion for Black girls, as though we don't give $1 billion to so many other things, is like, I think, a question that we grapple with regularly. It's the internal, did we go too far? are we demanding too much? When there's also a rage of like, we actually need to demand a lot more. And so I think I just consistently sit with this question of like, how do we create the conditions where people can actually not be overwhelmed by the question of abundance? So that when somebody said, like, so when we say, what do you need? They also include their healthcare and their healing practices and their Reiki and like all of the other things that we know that movement leaders need in order to be sustainable, their sabbaticals, that is not actually about abundance. And so I think that's the last question. Sorry, there are a lot of questions I'm sitting with, but the last one is really around what does it require of us to create the conditions where that question is not an overwhelming or a traumatizing one or a triggering one.
Whew, thank you. Lots of these, all three of you, you're like, this is just a question, but really there's like 5 different mic drops in your comments. So Shawnda, I'm going to pass it to you, and then Jodeen, and then there's just so many layers in this conversation that I want to hear from you both. And then we'll bring some other folks in as well. Shawnda.
Oh my God, the mic is so hot though. You know, at the point that you bring me in, the mic is so very hot that I don't actually know if I can touch it, but I'm going to do my best. First, I can't say enough how honored I feel to be in conversation with everybody on this screen. All of you, Ingrid, we just met, but I've heard about your work. Jodeen, Ariel, you know, it's lovely to sort of walk into a space sort of not knowing what's happening. And mind you, one of the things people told me when I started in philanthropy was, it's weird. And I was like, but weird how? And they're like, capital W, weird. And I'm like, but say more. And they're like, you just see. And absolutely, it's a really sort of interesting dance that sort of one has to do to sort of occupy this position. And I've been in the position for just a little over 2 years, you know, and you come in from movement work, you know, sort of with an abolitionist heart, you know, kind of knowing that in my perfect world, we wouldn't need philanthropy. Like I low-key don't believe in this shit. I was mentioning to somebody earlier today that it's kind of like progressive DAs, you know, and you're like, what an oxymoron that is, right? But I'm kind of like a progressive DA in a certain way, where in my world, we wouldn't have me. But, you know, when I think about philanthropy, there's nobody else that I would want to be sitting in the positions that you all hold than you all, right? And shout out, just before I go any further, to Maheen, to Pamela, to Mathew, to all of y'all who've had to hold those spots where you have to be accountable to communities. You know, and your funders aren't accountable to you, and they're not accountable to the communities too, but you have to behold that space, and you have to answer these questions, you know, and they're not always sort of yours to be addressing. So one, just shout out to the folks who have to just be in and sort of hold those positions. I will just start by co-signing everything that's already been said, and we'll just add a few things. I will say first that the grant making pieces, especially when you come from community, are the easiest pieces, right? You know, what do I need to do? Move more resources and lower the barriers to those resources. Fine, you know, and it's like, we all know what that looks like or what it needs to look like. The part that becomes more difficult for me sort of has to do with things like accountability, you know? And I think I spend a lot of my time sort of figuring out how to build a language around what's happening and what's been happening. And we say things like, oh, you know, racial and settler colonialism and yeah. But tell me the details, like name names, who did what, when, right? Like, give me some people to point to, like, and so a lot of what I've been doing in the last number of months has been sort of really sort of drawing a timeline that sort of looks at the impact of philanthropic disinvestment from the inception of philanthropy as it relates to folks of color, to women, girls, and gender expansive folks. And, you know, it's deep, you know, and I think, you know, you open a few windows and you have to close them because it's super deep. And I think that, you know, there are ways that the field of philanthropy, social work, our social welfare policy, social science research, all of these things evolved sort of around the same time and sort of work to naturalize one another so that we think concepts like rigor, you know, we think concepts like data-driven are just sort of natural and to be expected, when really those were the things that were just sort of used to exclude folks. And so I think the short answer for me is that we don't trust folk, and we never have. You know, that part's like super easy. So, but figuring out how to like really paint a picture to sort of understand the depths of that exclusion from philanthropy and the impact that it's caused over time, and the way that those policies and practices still sort of resonate in the ways that we even ourselves internalize them through ideas like stewardship. You know, because I think that half of the battle sort of, you know, once you get into philanthropy is not to be seduced sort of into philanthropy, to sort of, you know, be working in philanthropy, but not be of it. And so, you know, it's a difficult thing to do, to sort of occupy both existences. And I watch people, even people with really wonderful values, sort of struggle, you know, around sort of stewardship and sort of demonstrating that they're stewarding resources appropriately. Whereas me, I want to fund like a Republican. And they're like, what does that mean, Shawnda, that you want to fund like a Republican? And I say it jokingly, but Republicans will fund anything they think is aligned, you know? And it's like, you hate the gays? Here's some money. You hate the Blacks? Here's some money, right? You want to develop in poor communities? Bet. Here's some money, right? You don't know what that means? No, try it, fail, who cares? Here's some money, right? And I want to fund communities like that. I want to be thinking about how to create more spaces for innovation where you don't have to worry as much about whether people are going to be thinking, is this rigorous enough? Does this meet a data-driven standard? Because we already know that communities are the experts of the work. And if you create opportunities for more resources, they will do whatever needs to be done. So by that, I want to fund like a Republican. I also want to be able to think about making sure that in this particular moment, to your point, Maheen, that we're resourcing wellness and figuring out how to make that not seem like an indulgence, to make it not seem fluffy, but to think about it as a whole strategy, that wellness is an actual strategy, and that, you know, we can't have movements that are not anemic if we don't have movement leaders that are not resourced, that are not rested. And I was reminded of that on this trip, you know, as I've gotten just moments to sit quietly and think, to go out in nature, to ride the horses, to have my children cared for by people other than me. And just in this couple of days, I can just tell you that the creative sort of, like the creativity just started to come back, right? I started to just dream a little bit again. You know, just by having the moment to sit with people and to not have an agenda. You know, just that proximity sort of opened up so many possibilities for me. And that's the sort of thing that I want to make sure that more movement leaders have access to. So those are just the few things that I'll add to that really long list of things that my colleagues have already contributed to.
So many strategies emerging. I do want to open it up, but Jodeen, do you want to just close out the circle briefly, and then we can open it up a little bit to conversation?
Yeah, so much brilliance. Wellness is a strategy. I like just wrote on my screen. I mean, so I want to, there's so much just brilliance. I'm at a loss for words, but I want to touch a little bit on different types of philanthropic vehicles and ways capital moves as we turn to open up the discussion. And I'll just say, one, remembering where we started of we're not the only people working in philanthropy here, like everyone works in it in different ways. And also to say that as someone coming from movement, I'm in philanthropy because mentors and leaders who developed my leadership very intentionally were like, we're going to put you there. So just to say, like, the leadership pipelines, as they're so important across all different kinds of roles in our movements, and our leadership pipelines into philanthropic spaces, I think are also incredibly important as we need to continue moving organizers who are accountable to our movements and to our wellness into these spaces. One of the organizations I work with, the Movement Voter Fund, has a 50 person staff and moved about $130 million over the past 2 years. And what's unique about the staff is that almost everyone on the staff is not only a person of color, majority queer, trans, and LGBTQ, but also come out of the field that we're making grants in. And that's incredibly rare. And it's also incredibly hard, I think, for folks to make that transition, sort of as my, other folks have said, and just want to say what I like. I'll also say, like, at times it actually feels like doing sex work, working in a donor advising network. And I don't say that lightly, and I don't think it necessarily, I don't know that that's everybody's experience, but I say that because I think it's a complicated space to be in, and it's a space with so much privilege at the same time. And holding those contradictions and trying to be accountable to movements is like the work. And I so appreciated, Shawnda, what you said about the grant making is just the first, it's like the easy part of the job, but the maneuvering and figuring out, like private and public foundations literally only have to give away 5% of their money every year. That's it. Legally, that's it. That's all. In many cases, that's all they're supposed to give away. And so it's like, we're not even playing with the other 95% that is actually our money that was extracted from our movements and our folks' labor. And so, so grateful for the, things folks have said about building movement infrastructure that has a resource mobilization and movement building economy built into it as part of our strategies across roles. Philanthropy is just one part of it. And actually there's so much work in donor organizing networks outside of philanthropic institutions or impact investing funds that are not held in public or private foundations that are ways we can move. I think more, I've found that I can move more as an organizer in those spaces than perhaps within a philanthropic institution, and do so in a way that feels more in alignment and in more accountability to movement organizing. And I'm not saying that we should abandon private and public foundations by any means, but just thinking about what lessons we're learning about from within which types of philanthropic vehicles can we be in most accountable or mutual relationship with our movements is a question that's very much on my mind as we think about strategy for resourcing our movements. And I will stop because I want to hear from so many other people.
Thank you. Just deep appreciation for holding this conversation with so many layers. And just want to name some of the themes that I see coming up both in this conversation and also in the chat, which is, organizing, really approaching our opportunities for moving cash, moving resources to our people as like our primary mandate collectively, right? Partnership and accountability, what do those look like as we work together across folks in movement spaces, in philanthropic spaces, and outside of maybe private foundations in other kinds of resource-rich environments, and then flowing among all those roles that we play. And also just thinking about ecosystems, right? Like, how do we build for the long game, really, but get resources to folks fast. I also see that Saida has joined us. Thank you, Saida. And I know you're just joining, so I don't want to put you on the spot in any way, but if you want to pop in and say hello, welcome, welcome. Come join us.
Sure. Hi, folks. It's really beautiful to see y'all. I'm so happy to greet you from Beyonce's Empire, Houston. My name is Saida. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm part of Cohort 4. And it's really a joy to be here with y'all.
Thank you. It's good to see you. Glad you could make it. So I want to invite anyone in the circle or anyone in the room as a whole to just come off mic, raise your hand. We can bring you into the circle to just speak to anything that's coming up for you in these complex questions. I feel like we're all coming to this kind of knowing the purpose direction that we need to go, and there's so many different entry points. So I'm really curious to hear, what's resonating for folks, and what additional questions you may have to pose to this whole group here in the room. So feel free to raise your hand and Laurel can bring you in the circle, or anyone in the circle, please feel free to come off mic and jump in.
Ariel, can you repeat the question for me?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like what I'm hearing is, with all the complexity that's been named in all of what y'all shared, there's also kind of this clarity at the core, right? Like, we need to get money to our people, our communities, both fast and also thinking about the long game of how do we kind of redistribute at a pretty significant scale the extracted wealth and resources from our communities. So there's a lot of different strategies, and some of it that I heard that you were naming too is like what not to do. But also, like, how do we need to get information? How do we need to be thinking about organizing in partnership, in radical relationship, in accountability, just with all the different roles that folks in this room play? I'm seeing some comments in the chat. So if you're willing to voice your question or comment, we'll bring you on into the circle.
I think, I want to keep space.
Ariel, I was going to say, this has been great. Actually, everything that's been said has been, really powerful. My question really is in terms of that piece of your question around alignment, what do the nonprofits need to do to support you all in getting us that cash right away, and just getting more fluidity in terms of what we need to do on the ground? What do we need to do to support you all in that?
I'm not gonna lie. Go ahead, Shawnda. Were you about to say something?
No, you go ahead, Maheen.
I struggle with the question because I think y'all are doing enough. Like, I don't actually think, like, if we're actually in movement, then we each have our lanes, right? And like, I'm clear that my lane is to tell everybody who will listen who has a resource to give to girls, femmes, and gender expansive youth of color, that you can be a co-investor in that movement and that our liberation requires it. But like, so I don't mean to cop out, but it is, I think one thing I sit with around it is like, as an intermediary, like how can we be buffers to some of that structural violence that you all experience on a regular? I mean, Jodeen talked about it feeling like being in the sex trade. Like that's for, like, I look at it as like people, and like you're required to like dance for your money, and like that is not, and you would love to tell people not to dance, but like you also need to pay your staff. So I don't know exactly, except to draw on practices of mutual accountability. And like, how can we really try to be in right relationship with each other so that we can be accountable and like be open and honest about where power lives and where it doesn't, so that we can move together, that's all I got. I'm gonna stop now.
I'll follow you up, Maheen. I was literally gonna say almost the same thing. Whereas this part's my job to some degree, because I locate the problem with philanthropy. So I can't locate the problem with philanthropy, but then ask you to be doing a thing. So I think the thing I would say is to, and this isn't for something that organizations should do specifically, I think what makes it easier to support is being in deep relationship, being in really deep and as honest as of a relationship as possible, such that when issues arise, that I can be organizing and advocating on your behalf. I've gotten calls from folks in this room that says, hey, there's a thing that's happening with this one, what can we do? You got 5 on it, you got 5 on it, you got 5 on it.
Right.
Such that literally we can wrap around, right? It's like the way that I sort of see my job, to just, pull in a random sports metaphor, is to be blocking so that organizations can run the ball down the field. That's literally it. So yeah, I would just say figuring out, and and it's hard to just say, oh, be in deep relationship, when I know what the rest of philanthropy looks like, right? So
Right.
It's like, I'm asking you to do this thing that could be potentially not safe,
Right.
but figuring out who's on your team, which funders, which are those sort of social justice and aligned funders you can be in deep relationship with, such that we can sort of better support. But so much of my conversation today is directed at us. It's really having a conversation with sort of folks like the folks in this particular space around what do we need to do, sort of what are the ways we can do better.
No question. I appreciate that. And it's not that we need any more work, but just like, how do we hold you all accountable with everything that you kind of laid out, all the obstacles around getting us the money and really kind of respecting the work that people on the ground are doing? Like what's that accountability process look like? Because sometimes it was interesting about this conversation is that many times grassroots organizations don't even hear what the inner workings are. All they know is that they can't get the money, And
I'd offer that I feel like one of the ways that I experience accountability and know that I'm trusted is when people call and are like, because Shawnda, the grant making is just the easy part of the job, is so resonant. So like, Q, if you call and you're like, hey, there's this funder that's like, this whack thing is going down. I know you're not like a funder in that, but like, how can you help take this off my plate? Like getting those sorts of requests actually make me feel like I'm still accountable. I love those because I feel like then I'm still accountable in movement, and giving you all, like giving me jobs and work to do is like what I try to be here for. And so if we're on assignment in philanthropy, what assignments do you want to give us? So that we can organize other funders who aren't showing up in the ways that respect and honor the leadership of the work that folks are leading.
Thank you also. Go ahead.
I think one more thing that I think specifically for this community, like a community that is focused on ending gender-based and patriarchal violence, like the way that we understand and practice accountability is like very specific. And so I think that part of the work is to figure out how to very directly translate that. Like the work to end child sexual abuse is pushing us to engage in accountability in a way that I don't think anything else does, that is so transformative. That I feel like if we root it in like this movement in particular, I think there's like there's a much larger potential for some shift in power.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Maheen, and all of what you were saying, all of you was resonating with me too. I just wanted to add that I think that part about accountability, when there is deep relationship, I know it is something that's, definitely shaped by all the structural dynamics of power and relationships throughout philanthropy. And like, I do really appreciate it if I'm sitting in a role of a grant maker, for example, and somebody says to me like, this was not good, like y'all messed up, like, let's talk about this, let's work through this, because it's really important that, it's not like outside of this space we have this one relationship, and then when I'm in the funder seat, then you can't be who you are anymore. Like we're all trying to just be our whole people as much as possible, and it's we have to be called to account as much as we got to step into accountability, if that makes sense. So when it's possible, really making that invitation. I see hands. We have a great stack. Why don't we bring in Han and Isa into the conversation?
Hi, thank you so much for all of your reflections and experience. I want to share that I thought really long and hard before I crossed over into philanthropy as well, just in terms of what I learned from MEV and being a woman of color, and really negotiated the terms in which I crossed over so that I have influence as a woman of color, that I was going to really be able to remain intact throughout this experience. I came into a foundation that has been BIPOC led for 20 plus years. We have an activist staff. Our board is really diverse. We have been funding power building for 10 plus years to the tune of $1.8 billion. So it was an environment where, there was value alignment, but there was still a lot of work to do. And my work as chief learning officer was to really kind of make sure we don't brush under the rug all of the mistakes we made as a funder. In fact, it was really important to kind of say that we came in too rigid into this 10-year initiative, and we needed to kind of think about emergence and how important that is. I guess one thing I wanted to hear more from you all is kind of your thinking about how to affect larger structural changes. Earlier, Ariel, I think you talked about liberated gatekeepers. And so what is that role? Because we, for example, have been thinking a lot about how to use the corpus beyond 5%, whether it's through overspends, PRI, MRI, all of those different tools to really make sure that we leverage the larger endowment. We've done a social bond. And I think that's really significant because one thing we thought about in the $300 million that we leverage in the social bond was not to do a short-term rapid response, because that's what's going to lead to the fragmentation and reactive mode and to think about how can we use that to really invest in long-term movement infrastructure building and really kind of hand over that money to movement makers and make decisions about how to best spend that money. So I think there's a lot of things with trust-based philanthropy. We had a watershed moment this year where we removed the indirect cap for applicants. And that's huge for us, because it means that we support full costs. We don't want to burn people out. We don't want people working their own time. Same with the tipping rule. We did away with that as well. So lots of practices that I think we all need to learn from each other just to set the conditions. One last thing I'll share is that I come from a health foundation now, where health is important, but we've really broadened that around the social determinants of health. So by virtue of putting our stake in the ground to invest power building, it means, you could say that we're issue agnostic in the sense that we go where movement makers think is important, but I like to think it's not issue agnostic, but we're following leaders to the causes that they care about, in terms of what they think is important. So in any case, it's just, there's a lot of conversations we need to have just in terms of what the practices and policies look like. That's beyond the programmatic side. There's a lot of other things we can do in terms of the structure in which we're set up.
Anybody in the circle have any thoughts with what Han has raised? And we have a couple other voices we can bring in as well.
I wonder, Ariel, if maybe we bring in a couple voices so we don't get so inside baseball, but then maybe hear a few reflections and then tackle them together.
Yeah. Isa, I see your hand. Would you be willing to come off mic?
Hi, quick question. I have a question for folks who are working in philanthropy that have come from organizing and activist spaces and advocacy. And, I'm curious about the conversations y'all are having with your peers and colleagues and, speaking truth to power in spaces within the meetings that you have, this, the networking, what are those conversations with folks that you're trying to push and who are they come from rigid foundations and they don't necessarily prioritize relationship building. And because I feel like all the folks here kind of get it in terms of the nuances of how you build power and what does it mean to do this work and hustle, right, for money. And so I'm just wondering, I'm curious about those conversations that you're having with folks that are actually not on the same page. And what are those challenges? Is it that their foundation is just too strict and they're just too conservative and they just, they don't play with their money and it is what it is, right? It's very pragmatic. So is it that, are these there, I think it would be helpful for us to understand a little bit of the dynamics, because I feel sometimes it's not any things that we say in these spaces are things are not that haven't been shared for the first time, so I'm just curious about those dynamics that you all face, and what are those barriers?
I guess I'm going to jump in, even though I'm mad late to school. So for context, I am president of Funders for LGBTQ Issues, which is a philanthropic support organization. And I just want to start off by saying, so my background is basically as a hippie poet social worker, but with better shoes. And, when I got into this space, it was really, shocking. It was a culture shock, right? I think coming from, I worked at a radical feminist art collective. Honestly, my wife and my parents didn't really believe I had a job. Where, if we had $10,000 in the bank at the end of the year, we were like, look, y'all, we did it. We made it. Everybody gets an extra $100 in their check. Live your best life. And so to kind of go from that to spaces where people are talking about having hundreds of millions of dollars in their endowments and gathering for convenings every other 5 minutes, it just felt I was wait, is someone going to be throwing off dollars to everyone everywhere really soon. So there was this kind of that side of it, like just kind of the vast demonstration of wealth and access, as well as, kind of coupled with being in a lot of spaces where even if I wasn't being actively resented, it was implicit, that resentment, right? And I'm not going to go through and like kind of list through all of kind of the microaggressions or macroaggressions, but what I think is really necessary and critical for, for me in these spaces, particularly as we talk about, trying to work with funders, a lot of the experience has been of trying to figure out who the allies are. We're in a moment where it feels very surreal to me because I'm like, we're living in an Octavia Butler novel. And in fact, we're not even in the first one, The Parable of the Sower. I think we're in like number 2, right? And it feels incredibly frightening to be in this moment where there feels to be so much cognitive dissonance, right? Where folks actively on the ground are like dying and being harmed and weaponized, and it being so visible and so public, and yet it's not necessarily being matched with a commensurate sense of urgency by institutions that maybe you would anticipate that from. And so I think the focus for us at funders has really been on organizing with like our people, those foundations that get it. And like, yes, we're right there. We're trying to do this work in the best way that we can. And yet at the same time, we're in a moment where we need to figure out how is it we get that folks within foundations, even if they like the larger institution itself, like is not necessarily like friendly or doesn't get it. How do we get folks to recognize that even just by their proximity to power, that they have power, right? And what does it take for folks to kind of be able to stand up and take those risks that in this moment of, it feels horrible to say this, but imminent global collapse, like how are we standing, right, with each other? And so, I mean, I think for me, that's kind of the central question that I've been asking. And like, what are the rooms that it makes sense for me to be in? And if it doesn't make sense for me to be in it, how do I swallow my own pride? Because I feel like I should be in every room and get whoever the hell I think it is, I could get the other person who has access to those coins to like hear it and be able to translate it in a way that they'll believe it, because it doesn't matter anymore. I want us to be well. I want us to be alive.
All right. So I have the very difficult task of noting the time, knowing that this conversation is so incredibly rich and we have 3 to 4 people on stack. So what I would love to do, although I'm open to others who are co-creating and co-holding this space with me, is to hear from folks who've had their hands up for a bit. So I see MJ, Kajwa, Joanne, maybe Kalayo, if you're willing to come in, to just kind of join the conversation. And we know that wherever we are, when we end in a couple of minutes, that's where we are, and that the conversation will continue because we are in relationship and we will continue to be in this conversation together, hopefully. So any objections? Sound good? Okay. MJ, are you willing to come on mic?
Yes, greetings everyone. This is MJ. I'm calling in from Florida, Central Florida and Tacoma land. Yes, and I guess that my 2 rupee input would just simply be like, how do we intentionally get funders, philanthropy, and the gatekeepers of philanthropy to recognize and include the lives of Black trans women in this narrative, in this mission to be sustainable and to not have to sell our bodies. Because I second Jodeen is that every time we're applying for a grant, it feels like selling my ass to someone who doesn't even have it in them to give to me and my community so that we can actually heal, so that we can actually create and move change within our communities. Like Black trans women are still dying brutally. And even in these conversations where we are aiming to end violence against women and girls, it's still hard to be concrete, direct, inclusive that Black trans women of color. And I feel like we're still up against Black grassroots leaders. I feel like we're still up against this thing about not being enough, not being trustworthy, having similarities and a cloud of a lack of trust hanging over us and it expects us to do it all by ourselves. At the beginning of the funding that is being offered to us, it isn't even enough it's just barely enough to keep the lights on or keep the internet going, keep the systems going for another month. And it's always accompanied with a apology that I'm sorry, we can't do more for you. And I feel like at what time do we actually matter without having to get up there and shake our ass, sell ourselves as prostitutes, sex workers, and project ourselves as being the lowest of the lowest and the most fucked up people in the world, still to be told no? Like, who's advocating for us? Who's our ally when it comes down to funding? Because there are gatekeepers over this funding, and the funding is being poured into feminist movement. For some reason, it's very hard to still get trans women of color, BIPOC trans women, not TGNC, not gender nonconforming, but trans women of color in that narrative. And respectfully, I'm finding that fight so very, very hard. And my sisters are kick-ass bad, but when it comes down to the resources to build on that, to push that, to move that, it's back to square one for us. And I feel like this is something that it's always glossed over when we're having these deep conversations about moving funds and how to be sustainable and how to get people the monies that need the resources. I feel like we always don't have a spot there. And I feel like that's a great place to start.
I jump in next.
Yeah, please.
Thank you, MJ, for that. I actually, I just want to uplift what you just shared, and thank you. In my second point, so I have 3 quick points, and that is that many times it's especially right now, knowing that. Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Joanne. My pronouns are she, her. Hi, everybody. I love you. Let me back up one time and say I've got to see myself as part of philanthropy because of MEV and the deep relationships I forged at Novo Foundation, where I have, through MEV and Novo and movement, obviously met lifelong friends. I call and tell my staff over and over again, I say, we grow up together doing this work, right? So knowing we have a shared horizon, I know that I don't care if you're governor, I don't care if you're president, I don't care if you're a funder, like we have a shared horizon and we're people, right? And we're moving the agenda forward. So there's a level of trust there, expectation there, a knowledge there, and expertise there that is community driven because, we trust each other and we've been in community together. And I just want to name that requires a bench. That requires a lot of, I think a lot more conversations that are happening that, you know, I had called somebody like Alvin. I was like, he is actually the Harriet Tubman of philanthropy, because the time that we were going through Why We Can't Wait campaign, trying to simply get Obama to acknowledge, you know, Black girls within the narrative, trans youth within a narrative of a gender justice narrative that he was lifting up. The amount of organizing that needed to happen and funneling of program officers just to meet and talk about Black girls. And this was just 2014, right? Like 7 people came from one foundation and none of them knew they were coming because they didn't tell each other, right? And Black women got cursed out during this process. And, you know, those 2 years of organizing. I think it's extremely important for racial justice funders to vehemently center the lives of trans Black women, trans Black youth, and Black girls within philanthropy. And I name that because that's the hot ticket right now. When climate change is a hot ticket, I'm going to say the same thing, you know, about that, right? And I feel like, so that what that looks like is for M4BL, don't become a place in M4BL where, as a racial justice, you know, movement space, you know, you have the holistic expertise of everything. Like, be honest about who the experts are as we're sitting at that table, and actually foster those conversations so that we can have those funders meetings and we're leading them. We don't need you to speak for us because we're leading that work and you're leading the work you're leading, and we're collectively leading the same horizon. But it's important for us to be seen as organizations that don't get money that's trickled down. They get money because we're carrying a racial and gender justice lens, just as important as, you know, the huge conglomerate like M4BL. The last thing I'll say is that resources aren't just money, right? Resources are obviously who you meet. Resources are, you know, what you get access to. But it's also something as simple as, okay, like, how many foundations have wealth advisement planning, have investment 401k planning, understanding stock, understanding how you would form endowments. You know, this is a simple, like, share those resources, share those consultants, share those firms, so that organizations that are grassroots organizations can start to think about that. And these are things that I'm realizing 20 years later. Wow, had GGE done this in year 1 of coming out of OSI, you know, 18-month grant, okay, like a 1%er. Then 10 years later, Buffett grant, another 1%er. And now, you know, 20 years later, a Gates grant, another 1%er. Like, had I had the expertise and that offering, we might have an endowment and not have to be going paycheck to paycheck as an organization because we're doing this kind of work. And so we're in a good place and we're fortunate, but it's come at a high cost, and we're one of the few. And so I just want to name that, like, I'd love to be part of more strategies and conversations around how it is that we build, because sometimes it doesn't need to be so big. It can be small efforts over and over again, so that within the field that's not considered philanthropy, but is doing philanthropic work, we have the know-how to have your back, but also to have a shared strategy moving forward. I'll step back.
Thank you, Joanne. So I know we're a little over time, but I really want to hear Kaiser's voice, and then we'll just kind of let you close us out, and then we'll have a final closing circle word. And yeah, well.
Okay, I promise to be really quick. I even wrote it down. Yeah, I mean, just a few things that I've been thinking about and that I haven't heard, and I just wanted to put it out there. But I think these are thoughts and questions for foundations and program officers to think about. I think that during COVID, funding poured in, a lot of unexpected funding poured in. And what I saw after that was there is no sustaining after that. I mean, you have organizations that never got funding, or, you know, were like $200,000-300,000, and people poured in like another $200,000-300,000. But then now after that, like there's nothing. And so these organizations are kind of left without, never really had an infrastructure to actually build up to and to use, and really need some support in that. So I think that on the ground, we saw a lot of that happening, and we saw a lot of organizations that were just like, we just don't know what to do with this money. And so it wasn't really helpful, but it, you know, it's not helping. It shouldn't have been given, but that it didn't continue. And then the other piece, I think, as we are seeing this massive people leaving organizations and organizing, the transitions of in and out of leadership, the responsibility, the healing, the honoring of those who are leaving. And I also think that there's a responsibility in philanthropy to honor and to make sure that that transition is healthy by funding it, but also to fund transitions that are coming in, because we have a lot of young people and we need to skill them up. And so we're basically not putting people in place if we do not have the resources to train them up for those positions. And so I see a lot of failures in that sense also, and that we should probably like really look at that. And then those of us who are like leading, holding spaces on the ground, I think that a lot of the time people don't see us as leaders or organizers as those who are most impacted also. And so while people want us to hold space and get our members to shelter in place, we were not able to shelter in place because we were still coordinating and mobilizing, you know, through the uprising and through the pandemic. And so I think that there's a lot of aftermath of, you know, what happened to us as to what happened to organizations that were really severely impacted by the pandemic and the uprisings happening at the same time. The other piece that I see is that I think that the partnership between foundations and program officers, and especially those who come out of organizing, really understanding this, is somebody said it best, is that we have roles to play. And I think that it's important for program officers and foundations to understand that we're still on the ground mobilizing, and actually on a daily basis, we're putting our bodies on the line and to organize and mobilize base. And so I think that funders and program officers also have to understand those who guys that to trust us and to not make us jump through so many hoops, because we are actually still putting our bodies on the line in addition to moving and protecting and securing safety for communities. And then the last thing I wanted to say was, you know, I think that of course we all deserve funding, but we need sustainable funding, not just what's sexy now and what's coming in. And I'm giving you an example of the COVID funding, but also the anti-Asian hate violence funding. It's like they dump all this money on organizations, and then it's like it's no longer sexy, and so people are not talking about it anymore. And then on top of that, the definition of anti-Asian hate and anti-Asian violence is so narrow, has no gender analysis to it. And so people are really just thinking about the shooting in Atlanta, but really not thinking how sexualized that was, or really not thinking of the personal partner violence that Asian American women or Southeast Asian women have to endure, in addition to the state violence, the state sanctioned violence. And so I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just want to give lots of gratitude to everyone who joined this conversation, to everyone who kicked off the conversation: Jodeen, Aleyamma, Maheen, Saida, Ingrid, and truly, Shawnda. You're not in our circle, Shawnda, for sure. Just really, really sincerely hope that we can continue the conversation. Really, I want to be able to look back on this and say, remember when we started this and that together, and it was on that Zoom call, and then it turned into this thing. So I really hope that we can actually put some of these conversation points into real practice and action together collaboratively. So thank you all for taking the time and for the grace of an additional 15 minutes. Thank you. Much love.